Hello everyone, welcome to Zoonosis with Joy. I'm Joy, and today we're going to be talking about milk. So we're going to be talking about the ecological consequences of the dairy industry, how that social and ecological complex came to be, and what could be done to challenge that as well. So you're in for a little bit of a treat, and maybe a dairy treat, I don't know. If you like the video, of course, leave a like, comment, subscribe, that kind of thing. Feel free to check out the sources in the description. I've broken them up by section. And if you don't have to agree with what I say, and as I will say in here in a couple seconds, I'm gonna put a few caveats before we proceed. Caveat number one, most of my audience, I'm aware, is part of the unweaned, the people I would consider, consumers of dairy products. And I think that's pretty normal because a lot of us are living in the imperial core based on my YouTube algorithms. I kind of know who's watching my videos generally. And so it's probably likely that you grew up drinking and consuming dairy products of some kind. And I think it's totally reasonable to be, a little bit offended when some random weirdo on the internet is telling you not to drink milk. I think that I have some pretty cogent points that you could perhaps learn from, and maybe you'll come to a more nuanced position than I have. I don't know. And frankly, you can have your own position too. But I think that it's important to challenge yourself with perspectives that you're not super familiar with, especially those you don't agree with. So I'm trying to do this from a place of education and learning. You don't have to agree with my conclusions, but here we are. Other thing to keep in mind too is that, you probably, if you're like me, you grew up on the internet in an era where, you saw memes like there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, or memes that were saying like, luxury gay space communism, and this idea that we don't have to change any of our consumption patterns in order to, live in a just and radical world. We just have to wait for the revolution to come. Baby, I've been waiting a long, long time for that to happen, and I don't think I'm gonna live to see it. So I want to live and survive on the planet now as it is. That means we have to challenge it on, our day-to-day lives in whatever small, measly ways we can to stick it to the man, if nothing else. So doing changes, our consumption patterns may be part of that. It's not a total solution, granted, but changing small patterns of consumption can have knock-on effects that last for, generations. I also think that many people may be angered, cheesed off, a little bit off the teat if I talk about sociality and social problems and political problems in the same breath as ecological problems. I don't see these as separate things. I see them as mutually interconnected things. We can't understand how a beaver builds a dam and changes the environment to produce wetlands without understanding the social life of beavers, right? And why they feel the need to dam up streams and build lodges out of trees to protect, and build space for their families. And you can't understand these things as separate sort of phenomenon. You have to understand them as part of one social ecology. So there's that too. The final thing I'll note for some people who have a lot of trauma about internet discourse or, may just not be comfortable or familiar with some of these talking points, I use the term patriarchy, and I use it literally. Patriarchy means rule of the patriarchs, the individuals who have power and money and use it to control the lives of, especially women, but also men. And this ecosystem is where dairy emerged from. So it's kind of inevitable that I'll be talking a little bit about it. I don't want you to think that that means that men are not oppressed or something like straw man like that. You have to be a little bit more open-minded than that to deal with me. I'm sorry. That's the cost of admission here. So if you can handle those sort of things, I'll stop being preachy for 2 seconds. I'm going to enjoy my soy milk. Yes, this is soy. I'm sorry. And we'll go from there. This one's for the soy boys out there. Okay. All right. First part is going to be about the ecological costs of dairy, and the second part is going to be about how we got here, and the third part is what is to be done. So look forward to it. Here we go. Okay, part one, the ecological costs of dairy, or what are you talking about, Joy? Okay, so first of all, moo. Second of all, about 1/3 of all mammalian biomass, that's mammal with an M, udders and hair, and that kind of thing, there's my hair, are cows, right? So 1/3 of all mammalian biomass, that's all the whales, all the dogs, all the babies and humans and all, all the mammals, 1/3 of them are cows, 1/3 are humans, and 1/3 is everything else that I just mentioned there. Okay, so since the last ice age, there has been a lot more cows added to the Earth's biosphere than there previously have been. And this has changed Earth's ecology in some remarkable ways. One of them is that it's added a lot more carbon to the atmosphere. About 3.4%, right around there, maybe closer to 4%, of global carbon emissions is directly responsible from the dairy industry, right? So that's about 1.7 million tons of CO2 equivalents. And I say CO2 equivalents because not all greenhouse gases are CO2. The one that we're worried about most today, especially in this video, is going to be methane. Methane is a carbon atom with 4 hydrogen atoms, versus CO2 is a carbon atom with 2 oxygens. The problem with methane is that it's 21 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So eliminating methane emissions is very, very important if we want to continue living on this planet with a normal sea levels, normal temperatures, no deadly heat waves, fewer climate sort of things. I'm not going to be able to convince you of climate change in this video if you're a skeptic, I'm sorry. But I will talk about other things too, so keep your mind and eyes open that way. But you have to think about the cow. What is a cow? A cow is a fermentation tank on legs. Cows just eat grass, right? And how do you turn grass into this, right? Like this white kind of liquid colloid. What's happening there? Well, cows are ruminants, and what they do is they eat grass, and it goes to an organ, part of their esophagus actually, called the rumen. It's one of the 4 stomachs of the cow. There is the reticulum, the rumen, the omasum, and the abomasum. The abomasum is our chemical stomach like we have. The omasum is kind of like a filtering sort of stomach. It's a place where there's lots of surface area for lots of microorganisms to hang out, and it can help kind of regulate the things going out of the rumen. And the rumen reticulum is a big outpouching of the esophagus where a lot of that ingested grass goes in. And it is a wonderful microbiome for bacteria, archaea, fungi, and protozoans, and all sorts of different little fun guys, so to speak, to kind of get in there and break down that cellulose, hemicellulose, pectins, and all the other plant gunk and turn it into volatile fatty acids that the cow can then absorb in its small intestine for energy. And that volatile fatty acids can be then turned into lipids and proteins and lactose that can be secreted in the milk. But as a side product, this is the devil's bargain here, that process of fermentation produces methane as a byproduct. And that methane is released in their burps, it's released in their farts, it's released in their poop. And that level of methane can be a huge problem because it escapes into the atmosphere. And if you think about it, dairy cows are one of the most important sources of anthropogenic methane emissions. Not the only source. I mean, natural gas is methane, so sometimes those methane leaks can also get into the atmosphere as well. And natural process can also release methane into that atmosphere as well. Things like termites, that kind of thing too. But dairy cows especially, even compared to beef cows, produce a huge amount of methane per animal. And compared to other kinds of livestock, they're producing quite a lot. So that is a huge problem. But it's not the only problem that we see ecologically with cows, right? They also are consuming vast amounts of water, both directly in order to support rumination, the process of regurgitating, chewing, and swallowing. It takes a lot of spit to do that. I don't know if you've ever chewed food before. Hopefully you have. It takes a lot of spit in order to do that. It also takes a lot of juices to ferment stuff. I mean, you can't just ferment things on a dry blade of grass. You need fluid in order to do that. And also fermenting that kind of stuff as well takes a lot of water to grow those crops. And you also need water to rinse out the dairy stalls and that kind of thing, because I don't know if you've been around cows for very long, but they poop everywhere and it splatters and it's a huge mess. So you have to hose everything down. The machines take a lot of water to clean them, that kind of thing too. And All told, about 7% of the world's fresh water is consumed by the dairy industry alone. This is going to be an even bigger problem if we start to get to, climate change causing problems with freshwater availability. So it's going to be humans versus cows, which is just is wild that we're even talking about this. Other problems can emerge from the dairy industry as well. And, one thing that we don't like to think about is the fact that dairy cows cause a lot of biodiversity problems, right? So this is kind of harder to quantify and maybe a little less shocking than the first two things that I said, but it's still very important, right? So cows poop, and that poop gets into the water supply. The fertilizers that are used to grow crops also get into the water supply. And I don't know if you've ever seen a lake in summer that's like covered in green scum from like agricultural runoff, but that's what I'm talking about, eutrophication, right? It takes out all the oxygen from fresh water and kills anything that's living in it because all the algae just get amped up on all these like fertilizers. And this doesn't just apply to freshwater, it also applies to saltwater ecosystems and all that kind of stuff. And this causes huge problems for the organisms that are living there too. And we need those organisms in order to live, right? Not just for fishing industry stuff, but also the oxygen that's produced in our atmosphere is produced by microorganisms that are living in water supply. So important things are happening that our dairy cows are making worse. We also see problems with soil erosion, especially in the intense dairy systems that we have now. Because dairy cows will eat plants, we need to grow plants for them. And the heavy machinery and the extractive agricultural system that we have, it causes a lot of soil to get upturned and lost into waterways, into the air, that kind of thing, causing major problems for long-term soil maintenance and health that way too. Even the introduction of dairy cows into new ecosystems can cause biodiversity losses as well, and it can vary region to region. In New Zealand, for instance, dairy cows that are put onto pasture into new places cause a 70% decrease in local plant biodiversity, losses of native earthworms and that kind of thing, and invertebrates, and all sorts of other kind of biodiversity losses. In Ireland, they actually found that dairy cows can increase the amount of invertebrate biodiversity. And I think this might reflect the fact that New Zealand never really had any large mammal species for millions upon millions of years, whereas Ireland had wild cattle, aurochs, into the last ice age. So there's some different kind of knock-on effects that way. And finally, of course, dairy cows can also cause major problems for public health and human health too. And we don't like to think about humans and the environment. It's gross, we think about the environment, we think about trees, but humans are part of the environment too. And not all the ways that we interact with cows are beneficial for us, right? So you think about things like foodborne pathogens. I don't know if some people for some reason decided that Louis Pasteur should go eat a bag of rocks or something and decided that they just rather consume raw milk. They may be exposed to these sort of pathogens. I'm just spitballing here, but maybe pasteurization works to prevent us from getting E. coli, Campylobacter, Listeria, all the Salmonella, all the fun ones there. You could also say that cattle can also be a source of zoonotic pathogens. Historically, one of the most important, and even today, is tuberculosis, right? Bovine tuberculosis is extremely deadly for human beings, and of course, dairy herds in the United States have tuberculosis in certain states, and probably more states now than there were in the last 5 years, but that's neither here nor there. Dairy cow feces, I can't find a nice word for cow patties, they can also cause problems. So you have to think about how much poop a cow produces. It's a lot, right? So storing it in a place can be quite a challenge. The problem is if you store them in vast tanks, which a lot of dairy farms do because they're big operations, this can often lead to the breakdown of those the feces into very deadly gases like hydrogen sulfide, basically, which is, if you breathe it in, you die. And that's happened recently. There was a big gas leak, basically, where a dairy worker was killed, and then his fellow workers went to save him, and they also tragically perished as well. So this is a worker safety sort of thing, and working with dairy cows can be dangerous, both for the physical risks of being around machinery and large animals, but also, the fact that, you're going to be exposed to particulate in the air, these kind of gas leaks. You could also get zoonotic pathogens, that kind of thing too. I think most important for us as well is antibiotic resistance, because if we're exposed to animals that are treated regularly with antibiotics, we're at a higher risk of getting antibiotic-resistant infections. And that seems to be a problem with dairy workers, veterinarians, dairy farmers as well. And if we're consuming products that aren't properly, food safe, that, like raw milk, for instance, just floating that out there, you could potentially be at risk of those too. So dairy cows have a lot of problems for our ecology, and they can become a major risk for human, animal, and global health. But how did this all start? Where did we get to the point where we were all latched to the teat of dairy, to the point where we could be causing major problems in the ecological systems around us? Well, how does this happen, and what can we learn from it? Part 2, dairy patriarchy. Or, Joy, you can't say the word patriarchy on YouTube. I'm gonna do it anyway, because why are mammals so weird about milk? And I want to know this because it has huge ecological consequences, and we need to get to the bottom of it. So milk is sweat. It's a modified form of sweat that mammals, literally mammae, that's where the term comes from, they produce to feed their young. And mammals are weird about fluids. I don't know if you know this, but like pee and like sweat are like forms of like nasal kind of like pheromonal communication, but milk is specifically like a bonding ritual between the lactator and the offspring, usually. I use the term lactator, not because I'm woke, even though I can't help it, I'm just so perfect, but because not all mothers can lactate and not all lactators are women. It's a whole thing, don't worry about it. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. But the bonding is built into the system, right? Oxytocin, what is its job? It helps facilitate bonding, stimulates uterine contractions, and stimulates milk letdown. It's all part of the same thing. What makes us mammals is right there. It's in the social bond between the lactator and the offspring. I'm gonna keep doing this for like lactation and boobs. I just got like boobs on the brain, I'm sorry. I know that might be wildly inappropriate for some of you, but anyway. Allonursing is found in over 100 mammal species. That is nursing between a lactator and someone else's offspring. And this is great for many different reasons. It's found in domesticated animals and wild animals. It helps the lactator because they get to offload extra milk, and it helps build social bonds with other members of their social group. It can be helpful for kin selection and supporting some of their relatives' offspring as well. It can be beneficial for the original mother, right? Because they don't have to worry about nursing their other offspring all the time if they don't have enough milk. And it can be beneficial for the offspring as well because they get extra nutrients and they get immune exposure to multiple different lactators. So very important. Humans also allonurse, and in fact it's found in over 90% of human societies. It's not culturally universal, but it's very, very common. And in many traditional societies, it's between the mother and the grandmother. And this is a way of, mutually supporting each other, right? It's a form of kin selection. This is like grandmother hypothesis stuff, right? Like, why do we have older women besides the fact that they're hot? It's because they're important for the social reproduction of our species. And it's also important because members of people who are not necessarily strictly related to each other can form ways of building kinship outside of marriage. And in fact, in Islam, in Muslim countries and Muslim areas, right, it's a form of kinship where it's called milk kinship, right? So if you and someone else nursed from the same mother, you are actually considered siblings, and you can't marry each other. And this is a problem because in many Muslim countries, if they have like milk banks, people want to know who lactated it, right? So who's the lactator? Because they don't want their kids to do accidental incest with each other. So there's a whole problem and a whole kind of scope around that. I don't want to go so far as to say this is like a form of like natural matriarchy, but it's a form of power and social capital that you accumulate by nursing other people's kids, right? So I think that in humans that it's a very important thing that has gone radically understudied. It's very fascinating. But we're talking about dairy cows. We're not talking about people, womp womp. So let's talk about that. About 10,000 years ago, we started domesticating like small ruminants, and that is like sheep and goats, for those of you cool kids who aren't in the lingo like us cool kids who took domestication syndrome. You can check that out if you wanted to. That's my course that I did. Anyway, about 8,000 years ago, cattle were domesticated, and the earliest evidence of dairying is from 7,000 years ago from cows. So it seems that the domestication of these animals quickly led to ways in which humans, unique among all other animals in the animal kingdom, decided to drink someone else's milk from outside of their species. So they took allonursing and they did it to the next level. And what's interesting is that this was not probably pushed by women, it was probably pushed by men. And you have to think about it this way. In many traditional societies, pastoralism, which is basically the herding of animals, is almost exclusively an economic activity of men. That means you're gone from your village for a very long period of time, tending to animals, fighting off bandits, fighting off wild animals, and so it became a masculine profession. This has actually been linked to why some areas have female genital mutilation more than others. It seems to be linked to pastoralism because they're not around their wives, and so they're often worried about their wives getting sexual gratification from other men who may be around. So this sort of, and I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit about the patriarchy stuff, but let's think about this a little bit more logically. In many societies too, pastoral men, they measure their wealth in the number of animals that they're herding. We also know that in order to access marriage opportunities in many of these traditional societies, they would have to pay the bride price in the number of cattle that they have. And so this is where we start talking about dairy patriarchy. Now, I want you to read this book, and you should read it with my course because that's the best way to read it. But you could also read it on your own if you buy the book or other means. I'm not going to tell you how to live your life legally or illegally, but this book is pretty good. It's God, Man, and the Domesticated Animals. It's not perfect, but it is a good place to start to understand some of this stuff here, right? Because we think about it, the reproductive sort of aspect. I'm just going to drop this one. You should drop all your books. It's good for them. It helps strengthen the spines a little bit that way. But men with the ruminant domestication started to learn the facets of female reproduction and reproduction in general in a very specific way, right? Selective breeding, castration, assisted birth, lactation, bonding. This used to be very much the realm of women to worry about, and men didn't have to worry about maybe castration, they probably worried about it a little bit, but that really became knowledge and stuff, concerns of men in these pastoral societies and the earliest domesticated ruminant societies. And so this gave a lot of these dairy men a lot of information about how to control the reproductive lives of their women. And you think, okay, well, I don't care about what Neolithic men were doing with their wives. That's none of my business. I'm not a pervert. Well, the perverts wrote a book in the Iron Age. You may have heard of it. It's called the Bible. So they have all their weird kinks and all their weird stuff that way. But this has become a very popular sort of strategy. Think about all the different pastoral societies throughout history, why they were male-dominated and obsessed with the milk of their animals. It's because the patriarchs realized that if they got lots of these animals and they controlled lots of grazing land, they could have lots of wives, they could have lots of sons. And they did it this way to expand their power. And they expanded it everywhere. Dairy pastoralism very early on spread from the Zagros Mountains in the Anatolia and the Near East, and it spread eastwards to India and beyond. It also spread into Europe and the steppe. It also spread southwards into Africa, and cattle eventually evolved the means to resist things like trypanosomiasis. I've talked about that before with horses, but cattle evolved resistance against many of these tropical diseases which would otherwise kill them, driven by the dairy patriarchs penetrating further and further across the world. But they couldn't get across an ocean, at least not until about 500 years ago. And unfortunately, this is where I'm going to be talking about Crosby for a second. So you probably heard about the Columbian Exchange. Yeah, it's this guy, but he also wrote another book. This one is called Ecological Imperialism. I read it in another member school kind of like reading group, so if you want to check out the recording for that, you can also read it on your own. It's an older book. I'm sorry, I've got a lot of like notes here because this one has been racking my brain for a very long time. Drop your books. So Crosby, his whole thing in this book is that imperialism, in his mind, is demographic replacement of one ethnicity with another. And in this case, he's talking about how people from Europe replace people in the so-called Neo-Europes of the Americas, of Australia, New Zealand, and other places basically as well. And they use their animals and their plants and their diseases to do this. For our purposes today, I want to focus on cows because cows are one of the most, they're the forefront of this, and their ecological consequences are enormous. And it seems that cows were part of this sort of paradigm. There's a lot of problems with this book, and I think that it has some weaknesses, but the general thesis has some sort of ideas. I don't like his talk about imperialism because it doesn't talk about the bureaucracy or how that works, and he focuses a lot on race, which is kind of old-fashioned and has been outmoded by better books. So you should check this one out too. I haven't read this one for the memory school, so I probably will in the future, but Creatures of Empire, it's a good one. This one basically, I'm going to throw this one too, I'm sorry. This one is basically about how New Englanders, the Anglo-Dutch settlers of New England during the 17th century, basically started a race war with the Algonquin-speaking indigenous peoples that were living there by introducing their cows and their livestock. So they were too cheap to build fences around their livestock in the New World, so they just kind of let them roam around everywhere. I don't know if you know this, but like before the Columbian Exchange, there wasn't a lot of livestock. There was like dogs primarily in North America. So they weren't familiar with the concepts of animal ownership that were common in Eurasia for centuries and millennia by this point. And so they didn't recognize that, they knew that these were associated with the settlers, but they didn't quite grok the ownership relationships that they had. They also didn't really respect them either because why would they? These are just animals. And what do animals do? Is they wander around, they eat things, and they poop and trample things. So the cows do this especially, right? So cows will graze and they'll eat the crops, they'll trample on stuff, they'll scare off the wild game and cause a lot of ruckus. And so this made a lot of the Algonquin peoples very mad, and they would often kill these animals that were trespassing, right? Which is what they were doing. But since these animals were owned by specific owners, the settlers would take those people to court. Eventually they got tired of taking them to court and started doing like extrajudicial killings basically. And this eventually led to a lot of tensions between the settlers and the Algonquin speakers. I'm really flattening the history. I hope you get that. You should actually read the book to formulate your own opinion on this. But eventually this led to King Philip's War, which was disastrous and led to genocides of multiple indigenous groups. This pattern of interaction spread throughout the Americas as settlers and their animals, primarily cattle, moved westwards and formed part of that Manifest Destiny thing. One final book, I'm sorry I can't throw this one because I don't have a physical copy, but you should buy a physical copy because this is probably one of the few good books out there on the subject, but it's called Decolonizing the Diet. Great book. Basically the idea is that indigenous food systems were replaced by European food systems, and this caused massive problems with immunity. You know, you got these calorie-rich foods replaced foods that were rich in micronutrients and antioxidants, which led to worsening immune outcomes, higher fertility, and more crowding and that kind of thing, as well as the introduction of livestock introduced a lot of zoonotic diseases like the tuberculosis I mentioned earlier. Hopefully I mentioned it earlier. And this led to a lot of the epidemic diseases that we see in following colonization in the New World, right? We often think of these as immunological naivety, but a lot of it was diet as well. They didn't have the proper diet to fight off major infectious diseases. And if you have a lot of food in your diet, you're going to be, you're able to ovulate through lactation, and you're going to have more children. And this means more people crowded in a small area. And I don't know if you know about smallpox, but smallpox loves crowded areas with lots of people and minimal sanitation. So that became a huge problem as well. So we have to understand that the invasion of cattle across the world was devastating to a lot of indigenous peoples. And it was devastating in a way that greatly benefited the settlers there. We should also keep in mind that the Europeans also had a dietary advantage in the fact that they could largely, not entirely, digest lactose. They had lactase persistence genes. And this seems to have evolved a few thousand years ago, that these pastoralist groups, as they spread outwards, became more and more able to digest the lactose. And, most animals aren't able to digest lactose into adulthood. That seems to be a human thing, and only about 1 in 3 people, or 1 in 4 people, I've seen different kind of estimates, are able to properly digest lactose. And it's not everyone who you think, because there's many pastoral groups, like, let's say, like in the eastern steppe, that aren't able to digest lactose. And you also have like foraging groups and hunter-gatherer groups in Africa that have independently evolved their own form of lactase persistence genes. There seems to be like polygenetic stuff happening in Africa that's related to this that has nothing to do with this kind of evolution. Really cool stuff, but suffice it to say that it greatly benefited the people who evolved with these animals as they spread them across the world. But that happened hundreds of years ago. Why does this have to do with the ecological problems we have today? Well, the last 100 years have been very testing, last 150 years I should say, have been very testing for the ecological stability of the planet related to dairy. We have to understand that there's been multiple inventions that have happened that have greatly accelerated the dairyfication of the world, if we want to call it that, and have helped out dairy patriarchy a lot. One of them has been refrigeration, but also the invention of these shelf-stable products like condensed milk and processed cheeses. This has allowed for those shipping of products overseas outside of their local area of production. And that means you could have much more intensified dairy operations than you could before. You just need to have one person with enough seed capital to buy up a dairy farm, get a lot of cows together, pump out a lot of dairy products, make those shelf stable somehow, and ship them off across the world. Very beneficial if you're doing world wars across the sea. And in fact, that's what happened in World War I and World War II, is the government started buying lots of dairy up and shipping them to soldiers across the seas. This made the dairy people very rich. It also made them very vulnerable to when wars ended. So the government had to step in to deal with overproduction crises and to deal with the fact that they had all these dairy farmers who are now getting their product bought directly by the government, especially in America. One of the things that happened was the Americans continued buying milk publicly and then storing it in giant vaults underground. There's like cheese vaults. It's wild. And this became a huge thing in terms of foreign aid. So many parts of the world are receiving milk products as part of foreign aid. And so cheese and dairy products have been introduced to parts of the world where they were not very popular until very recently. And has become a large part of the recent growth of the dairy industries, because the imperial core has been, and the dairy patriarchs of the imperial core have been making consumers of the entirety of the periphery of the planet. But also the people living in the imperial core as well. Because, I lived in the 90s. I remember got milk, right? They're targeting children at a very young age with these kind of like messaging, right? That milk's good for you, that it's a part of a normal diet, that you need to drink it. You need to drink it now. You need to drink your milk now. Okay, I gotta drink my milk. Okay, I messaged myself. Oh, I love something. Okay, so that's a big problem. Other problem too is formula. So this is kind of where it gets even worse in some ways. Colonial authorities in Africa, Latin America, and in Asia, they liked milk formula a lot because they felt that it could help with the sanitation of colonized women and help improve child mortality outcomes. And in some ways it did. It also greatly increased the fertility of women in colonized areas. Part of the reason is that, like I mentioned, if you have a high amount of, if lactation is energetically expensive and it competes with ovulation in human beings, to the point that if you have something else that's taking the burden off of lactation, you can go through ovulation again. You can have another kid earlier than you would expect. And in places where there's not a lot of contraception, that means that populations would explode in places where there was a lot of access to human infant formula, that kind of thing. And so colonial authorities both benefited from the sanitation improvements, but also the benefits of introducing this elsewhere. And the effects of this have been kind of disastrous, because what it does is it perpetuates poverty in many places. You have large families, they're not able to take care of all the kids, they don't have any contraceptions to stop more pregnancies, and this becomes a perpetuating cycle of poor workers in the colonized or peripheral world that have grown up with generations of this kind of problem. And some of it is also predatory too, right? You know, we've heard the stories of Nestle Purina and what they've done to like women in colonized parts of the world, right? In the peripheral parts of the world. And some of what they've done is quite horrible. They've actually given free samples of formula to lactating mothers so that they would stop lactating and be forced to buy the product and be forced to spend the family's minimal income to support Nestle Purina's giant fucking milk patriarchy machine, right? I'm sorry, I used the bad word there, but you get the point, right? Like this is a huge problem. And the fact is that over time, this dairy patriarchy has gone from small local scaled, farms where, the only people who are really like benefiting would be like the guy who had a small herd of cows and maybe a wife or two. But now it's like the dairy farms are massive, concentrated things that get a lot of government funds, a lot of government protection, they get subsidies, they get all sorts of things, and they have global markets that they could sell to. In fact, I've made an argument in one of my previous videos that one of the drivers of the Canada-US kind of trade war stuff that's been going on for the last half a year, this may become out of date, I don't know, has been the dairy industry, right? And we know that the dairy industry in the United States is structured slightly differently than Canada, but the American dairy farmers want to access the Canadian market, and that seems to be one of the drivers of the reason that they want tariffs on Canada to punish them for having different kinds of dairy markets there. So, that all said, we've created a world in which dairy has become an alienated commodity, where we're all addicted from a very young age to consuming dairy products. Dairy milk, cheese, yogurts, all that stuff, right? And it's gotten, and butter, all that stuff, right? And it's gotten to the point where it's causing these massive ecological knock-on effects. We have the climate change, freshwater resources are dwindling, biodiversity problems are escalating, you've got the public health problems all coming together. So what is to be done? And how do we reconcile the existence and the flourishing of dairy patriarchy, and how do we respond to it? Part 3, wean the world, or stop drinking milk, damn it. So let's talk a little bit about solutions to the ecological problems and the social problems, and what can we do about all of this? Well, one thing I don't think will work, and this might make people angry, is organic dairy farming. So, why? Well, let's think about it this way. Between 1944 and 2007, the average carbon output of 1 kilogram of milk has decreased. Part of this was the transition from horses to tractors in terms of cropping, that kind of thing. But it's also been improvements in nutrition. So concentrated, total mixed rations is what we call them, rather than pasture grazing cattle. It's also been the introduction of things like antibiotics, pesticides, and chemical fertilizers. Things that improve the efficiency and mean that there is less carbon, less inefficiencies that cause more of that methane to be produced per kilogram of milk. And that is something I don't think is easy to reconcile with organic dairy farming, right? Where you want to avoid pesticides, you want to avoid chemical fertilizers, you want to avoid antibiotics, that kind of thing. In some cases, they also want to avoid the tractor and go back to horses, which, pros and cons to that, or oxen. The other part of it too is that extensive grazing systems can also be bad for biodiversity. Like I mentioned, in certain parts of the world that are ecologically less suited for cattle grazing, this means that you're going to have to clear land, you're going to have to destroy these kind of ecosystems. And that can be a huge problem if we want to minimize our ecological footprint. It also means that you're probably going to get more things like, you're going to have that problem of balancing intensity with extensiveness. So I think that the fact is that it may be beneficial under certain marginal conditions to do this kind of organic dairy farming, but I just don't see it. And I don't know if that's something that has been a deliberate obfuscation or if that's been something that wishful thinking, that kind of thing. There's a lot of people who say, okay, well, I don't have to worry about my impacts because I get my milk from my uncle's dairy farm and he treats his cows really well. And he seems like he's doing a stand-up job minimizing his carbon footprint. I've never met your hypothetical uncle, so I can't argue with that. But at the same time, I think you got to be aware of the fact that most people aren't getting their milk from no farm that your uncle runs, right? Most people are getting it from these highly intense systems. And if we all switch to an organic dairy production system, it's not going to be sustainable at scale. And that's what we're worried about, is we're worried about the planet. We're not worried about how you can morally justify living on this planet, right? And the impacts that we all share. It's a collective responsibility thing, right? So I want to talk about how can the dairy industry be reformed from a more scientific informed perspective that way. And like I mentioned, efficiency improvements seem to be one of the best ways of doing that, right? Improving nutrition and having better nutritional kind of things seems to also improve the efficiency overall. It's kind of a win-win, you know, you get more bang for your buck in terms of feed, but you also have less carbon output overall. This comes with some costs in terms of, you know, you have to buy the total mixed rations from someone else or produce it yourself, which can be quite expensive. It also can mean that you have to transition cattle in a kind of complicated fashion to a total mixed ration, that kind of thing. So there's kind of that problem too, but overall it can be quite good that way in terms of carbon emissions alone. There can also be ways of using sort of like feed additives, that kind of thing, to improve change the rumen microflora and that kind of thing. And they haven't really found one that works yet. They've experimented with things, and I think new developments are happening every single day, but there might be a techno fix that also works that way too. And improvements in cropping and that kind of thing too could also potentially reduce carbon outputs, that kind of thing as well. Overall, if you look at some of the ways in which you could reduce and minimize these outputs, you can get about 30% reduction in the amount of methane, which isn't insubstantial, but it's not a complete solution. You know, it might be one of the ways that it could be changed. So credit where credit's due. There seems to be some evidence that that's also a way that dairy could be made more sustainable potentially in the future. Okay, and it seems to have improved in many ways that way. It doesn't change the fact that you have a lot of concentration of cows in one area. You're going to have a higher chance of, you know, zoonotic outbreaks. You're also going to have more effluent, that is code word for poop, ending up in water supplies or local draining of freshwater supplies. So pros and cons, there's a lot of tensions with that strategy too. But there are ways of dealing with like the poop in ways that other people have been doing for decades, right? So if you think about all that decomposing kind of like fecal matter, you could potentially use that to use for fuel, right? So the carbon that's released from these sort of things, the methane, that's the same thing as swamp gas. It's the same thing as natural gas. And has been used for electricity generation in many countries. So it is something that could be done to actually, you know, mitigate some of those costs. Granted, it's not carbon neutral, it is still releasing CO2, but you could look at that as one way of dealing with it as well. But I'll be honest with you, I mean, after hearing about all those workers on the dairy farm getting killed by the sour gas leak, I don't know how happy that makes me. I'm not satisfied with let's say the dairy industry is perfectly honest and that they're going to always work the best, and I don't believe that, but let's say that's true. It's only going to give you certain kinds of leverage that way, and it's not going to stop the dairy patriarchy from wanting to get more and expand their market outreach and expand to different markets and try to put dairy products in more and more foods and try to accumulate more and more wealth so that they can attract more and more women to their, you know, the dairy patriarchs could sit on the throne of money and women and destroy the world in the process. For me, I'm kind of, well, I'm a little bit skeptical about all that. I'm also skeptical that this is something that some theoretical revolution in the future is going to solve, because I've lived long enough to become jaded and filled with disappointment. So I want to do things now. And there are certain ways I think that we can make a difference that are small, but they can make an outsized impact, especially at scale. And this is where we get to weaning the planet, and we will wean the planet and wean the world. Damn it, I messed up the title. So how does that look? Well, for starters, it basically means stopping drinking and consuming dairy products and encouraging others to do the same thing. It's not the same thing as veganism, and maybe it's a little less like radical that way, but there's a lot of people who are hung up on the whole don't eat meat thing, right? Because it seems a little bit too acidic for them. Humans have eaten meat for all of their history, basically, in many parts of the world, and eating meat is very culturally important. Whatever. Okay, fine. I can grant that. Yeah, I personally am vegan because I can sustain it. I cook for myself. It's not expensive. It's not a burden for me. I live in a place in the world where I can get lots of plant-based products, and I can make a lot of different foods that are quite tasty, and I don't mind it at all. So it's a very easy sacrifice for me to make, and I think it, for the animals and for the planet, makes a lot of sense.
Hi, this is Joy from the editor's desk. So, there might be a few of you out there who have been influenced by, well, let's face it, the dairy industry and their protectors and defenders and apologists, that plant-based alternatives are not so much better for the environment. And to that, I just say, look at the evidence. Plant-based alternatives far better for the environment. The people will say, well, they clear out large parts of the Amazon to farm soy, and that is true, but that soy is being used to make total misreactions for cattle, especially for beef cattle, but partly for dairy cattle as well. So looking at it from that perspective, the genocidal land expropriations that we see in the Amazon currently that are killing the lungs of our planet, it has to do with cows. It doesn't have to do anything with the plant-based products that are out there. If it is, it's vastly, vastly much smaller. And we could look at much more sustainable alternatives, things like oat milk, that kind of thing. I don't know. I think that if you're doing anything plant-based, you're probably off on the better foot. Some people also say, well, the plant-based alternatives aren't as nutritious. And yeah, I think that's fair. There's definitely more fats and proteins in milk products, but only 1/3 of the population can actually digest lactose. So I don't really know where people are coming from. If it causes you like gastrointestinal upset and diarrhea from drinking it, is it really doing that much good? So, maybe the plant-based options are actually better for more people and less environmentally impactful. And the flavor, I think, is pretty comparable for a lot of them. Dairy-free cheese has gone a long way in the last 10 years and probably will get better as time goes on. So, there's something to be said about all that there.
But for the rest of you, why don't we start with something simple? Why don't we just wean ourselves off of dairy? Now, a lot of people may have cultural hangups about that. Dairy is a big part of our culture. It's a big part of our food. Our family might object to it. It means I can't get a cheeseburger anymore. What are you talking about, right? So there's a lot of ways in which we've been impressioned as young children to accept certain things as normal, and that can be very, very hard to overcome. But one day, we're going to have to grow up and realize that sometimes we have to change the ways that we consume and interact with the world in order to make a positive difference. But we shouldn't do this willy-nilly, and I think we can actually learn from cows how to do that. So the ways that I like to think about this is that cow weaning can be traumatic or it can be a natural process. At a certain age, all animals have to stop drinking milk. And the way that can be done is through force, or it can be done through the gradual willingness of that offspring to start eating only solid foods. And how does that look like? Well, if we want to avoid the tragic aspects of it, and I've made a whole video about how the dairy industry has completely ignored some of those welfare concerns, go check that out if you can. There are certain things that we can do to avoid that own problem if we're just starting to get into a dairy-free lifestyle. So the first and most important thing is that your health comes first, right? If your doctor or dietitian or whoever has told you for specific reasons that you should not change your diet for any reason, say, any kind of health condition or eating disorder or whatever, avoid my advice entirely, focus on your health, because that is the most important thing. Second part of it too is that you don't want to do it during times of stress, right? Weaning is stressful. It raises your cortisol levels, it reduces your immunity. So if you're going through big exams, a big breakup, moving, life changes, now is not the time to also change your diet as well. This is something that you should do when you are in a more stable place. So that's the other part of it. Other thing too is you shouldn't go full hog. You shouldn't just like, one day I'm a big cheese eater, I'm the cheesiest cheese girl in the entire planet, and the next day I'm off the sauce. I'm off of it. I'm gonna just go dairy free and expect it to. No, you got to introduce yourself to dairy free options early, and you got to wean yourself off over days or weeks, basically, and that can take some time. You know, if you want to get your cow off of the teat, you can't just separate them immediately and expect things to go well. You also shouldn't cut yourself off from the social groups around you. And this is one of the most traumatic parts of it for many, nursing animals, right? If they're separated from their mother and they're not allowed to, be around them at all, you're going to have to deal with the oxytocin aspect of it. You're going to have to deal with the social bonding aspect of it. And this can be traumatic, right? So this often can lead to the most stressful aspects of it all. If there's any major social barriers for you to stop drinking milk, you need to find out ways that you can deal with that, or get more people on board, or something of that nature. You should still consume foods with your friends. You should still find ways to consume foods with your family and possibly share in the same foods. But it may mean that you have to alter your diets and get other people on board as well. So it can be a little bit tricky to navigate those sort of things too. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. Weaning is not easy. But you're going to have to do it at some point. And, eventually we all have to grow up and kind of do things that are uncomfortable for us. So it's better to do it with other people, and it's better to do it with the comforts of the people that we love around us, without having to change things too radically, too quickly. So those things in mind, I think it is more than possible for you, if you have the means and the opportunity, to go dairy-free. And collectively, I think this will make a difference, because it means that there'll be fewer people consuming dairy products. And over time, this may mean that we're less reliant on the dairy industry in general. They'll become less politically powerful, and they'll eventually waste away into irrelevancy. And dairy cows can be respected as the beautiful, wonderful animals that they are, and we don't have to be completely at their teat of the patriarch for the rest of history. So that is my pitch for weaning the world. And if you got this far in the video, congratulations, it's a doozy. It took me forever to film it because I keep getting this my brain just keeps going off in random directions, spiraling off, and I keep messing up the recordings. But thank you so much for watching. Check out my courses. You can check them out at the Members School, getting a subscription, that kind of thing. You should also check out the other videos on this channel. Please leave a comment. I don't know if I've reached anyone. I don't know if any of you are actually going to go dairy-free because of this video, but if you are, say so in the comments, and maybe that'll encourage other people to do so as well. So that all in mind, thank you for drinking this in a little bit, so to speak, and I hope to see you next time. So.